I'm George Lombardi. I'm the general manager of WSHU Public Radio. That's Sacred Heart University's NPR station, housed in that little house right across the street. I want to thank you all for coming today. We're thrilled to have you here. WSHU, not only is a public radio station, but as one, we have a mission to try to do things to involve the community and to become more of a community resource. So that's why I'm extremely excited this afternoon to welcome NPR's correspondent, Corey Flintoff, here today to join us for a discussion. I'd also like to thank the McInnes family of Fairfield who made all this possible. They covered the cost of bringing Corey here today. You know, Corey Flintoff in his journalism career, has taken him to more than 50 countries. He spent the past 4 years reporting for NPR from Moscow. He's covered the Ukrainian revolution, the seizure of Crimea, the downing of the Malaysian Flight 17, and so many other stories I'm sure you heard. At the same time, I'd like to welcome our own reporter, Ebong Udoma, who will be interviewing Corey this afternoon. He's WSHU's senior political reporter, and he's the host of a new podcast we've just launched called Capitol Avenue. So I really want to thank you again for being here. And before we begin the discussion, we have one thing we'd like you to see.
Corey Flintoff reports from the capital, Kiev.
Corey Flintoff reports from Vilnius.
NPR's Corey Flintoff reports from Moscow.
Corey Flintoff visited one of those vessels in Crimea.
Corey Flintoff has the view on the Syrian peace talks from Moscow.
NPR's Corey Flintoff reports from Donetsk.
At one of the main debris sites, local search and rescue men in blue overalls stoop over the blackened ground, lifting barely recognizable objects from the wreckage and placing them in body bags. The rebels control this area, and a pair of them stand guard nearby. The supervisor of the search team from Donetsk won't give his name because he's not supposed to speak to reporters.
Statistics issued by the World Anti-Doping Agency last June indicate that Russia does, in fact, have a bigger problem than most. The figures from 2013 show that Russia was the world leader in doping violations, with 225 that year, 42 of them in track and field.
The young soldiers didn't have gas masks, but some of their attackers did. After more than 3 hours, the authorities brought in trained riot police who severely beat activists and journalists, arresting at least 9 of them. By that time, Batusov says, the hooligans were nowhere to be found. He says they were provocateurs who were paid and protected by someone in the government and who set upon ill-equipped young soldiers in an effort to create casualties, discredit the opposition, and produce scenes of violence for the mass media.
There were many younger people in today's procession, but it's not clear whether they feel hope or whether that hope will translate into activism. Corey Flintoff, NPR News, Moscow.
Corey Flintoff, NPR News, Kiev. Corey Flintoff, NPR News, Donetsk.
Corey Flintoff, NPR News, Vilnius.
And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome to Sacred Heart University, Corey Flintoff, and welcome to our stage, Ebong Udoma and Corey Flintoff.
Thank you. So Corey, welcome to Connecticut.
Thank you. And thank you in addition for that nice production at the start. You know, my first job at NPR was to be a newscaster, and the beauty of that job was that you got to say your name 12 times a night. Since then, I haven't heard it quite so often on the air as we did just now.
Well, it was a very nice sampling of some of the work that you've done. And I remember when I met you back in 2000 when I was down in Washington when I worked at the news desk at NPR. And at the time, you were a newscaster. And I must say that you were one of the more pleasant newscasters that I had to work with. You're always gracious with your time and extremely generous. So tell us, what is it like in Russia right now? How does Russia look at the American elections right now? Because they seem to be playing a pretty prominent role if we take into consideration what we heard during the vice presidential debate only a couple of days ago.
I have to say that there's a great deal of interest in Russia in the U.S. election campaigns. President Putin himself has been very careful not to say anything specific in favor of one candidate or another, and in fact, he said specifically that he doesn't interfere in the elections of other countries. You can believe that or not, as you like, but many of his surrogates and many Russian politicians and Russian officials have expressed a preference, and their preference is for Donald Trump. And I talked to some Russian analysts about this and asked them, what they think the Kremlin's reasoning here is. And what they said essentially was that they believe that Kremlin officials essentially think that Donald Trump would be a better bet for Russia and a better communicator of American and Russian interests because they see him as a deal maker. They see him as someone who's not ideologically tied to any particular position against Russia. They see him as someone who's had positive words to say about President Putin. And they think that conceivably they could do business with a man like that. At the same time, analysts told me that they do consider Trump to be an unpredictable figure, as someone who could conceivably fall into bad relations with Russia, but something that they're willing to take a chance on. Because they see Hillary Clinton as someone who is adamantly opposed to the current regime in Russia, to someone who will not be doing another attempt at a reset with Russia this time, and someone who's going to take very hard-line positions on things like Syria and Ukraine and the sanctions against Russia. So that's why there's a great deal of interest. It's also, interestingly enough, speaking of surrogates of the Russian regime, the American University in Moscow recently did an online presentation in which a number of their professors and their president came out explicitly in favor of Donald Trump and said that they believe that he's someone who is going to promote better relations with the United States.
The theme of our discussion today is Resurgent Russia and misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, and sometimes outright lies. One of the clips we saw at the beginning of this was your coverage of the downing of MH17 in eastern Ukraine a couple of summers ago. Could you just tell us a little bit more about what you were able to do and how the story was being carried in the Russian media? Because there seem to be so many different versions of what was actually going on. And you were telling me earlier that this is a classic example of how misinformation is put out in the Russian media and from the Russian state.
Yes, if you've been following this story, you know that Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine in 2014, leading to the deaths of 298 people, most of them Dutch citizens. I was there within a day after the plane went down when they were still combing through the debris field, looking for bodies, trying to piece together what the evidence might be. Things were very chaotic. Debris was scattered in several different locations, and there were all kinds of theories about what had happened to this airplane, and that nobody at that point knew clearly what had happened. Well, this just turned up in the news again because the Dutch Safety Board just released a report based on its 2-year investigation of this case, in which they said definitively that this plane was shot down by a Russian anti-aircraft missile system called a Buk, and they said definitively that this anti-aircraft system was brought across the border from Russia into eastern Ukraine on the day that that aircraft was shot down. It was parked in a field at the time the aircraft passed over, and it fired its missile, shot the plane down, and was subsequently taken back into Russia the following day. At the time, there were a lot of conflicting stories that came out of the Kremlin and out of the Russian Defense Ministry. Some of them were absolute science fiction. There was a story that was floated on the internet that this was a dummy plane that had been filled with previously dead bodies that had been collected from morgues in Western Europe and planted aboard this plane, which was then flown over eastern Ukraine and blown up in a way that was designed to embarrass the Russian government and the rebels in eastern Ukraine and make them look like murderers. This is straight out of science fiction television. There were the sort of prevailing story that was put out by the Russian Defense Ministry was that this plane was shot down by a Ukrainian fighter jet, and the Russian Defense Ministry presented as evidence a satellite photograph that showed the area allegedly as the plane was passing over it, and it showed, you could see a small image in one corner of the photograph of a Ukrainian fighter jet. So it seemed like pretty damning evidence when it first came out. In fact, a citizen journalism group known as Bellingcat.com, you can find them online, and they're one of the finest examples to me of how citizen journalists can be organized to investigate any kind of a news story. This group, which is called Bellingcat, called on all its members to comb through the online photographs that were taken but that were associated with MH17 and see what they could find. One of the first things that they found was that the photograph released by the Russian Defense Ministry was a fake. They compared that particular satellite photo with photos that had been taken a week or so in advance and a week or so after the plane was shot down. And they found that sure enough, a few days before the plane was shot down, there was a photograph with the exact same cloud formations in it as the one used in the Defense Ministry's piece of evidence. So that in fact, it was clear by the cloud patterns that this photograph had been taken several days before the plane was shot down. The second thing they found was that the tiny Ukrainian jet in the picture had been photoshopped. So this thing was an absolute fake. Why would the Russian government and the Russian Defense Ministry go to such lengths to try to issue a number of confusing and false narratives about what happened? Well, as we've seen, Russia has consistently denied that it had any involvement in the war in eastern Ukraine, that it was supporting the rebels in any way, that it was providing them with military support of any kind, and most especially that it was not putting Russian military personnel across the Ukrainian border. So it was absolutely impossible for them to admit that this aircraft had been shot down even by mistake. Because having done that much, then it would have opened up the whole question of what was this Russian military equipment doing in eastern Ukraine when in fact you had adamantly denied that it was there. So, the sort of misinformation techniques are things that go back to, propaganda of all kinds. First, you put out a bunch of confusing and conflicting narratives so that what the public hears is essentially a lot of chatter and a lot of noise. And the average person who's trying to figure out what's going on hears, well, the Russians shot it down. Well, the Ukrainians shot it down. Well, maybe it was some kind of an incredible conspiracy.
You know, and competing narratives like that tend to drive out the truth, and they tend to drive out the search for facts. And like any piece of bad news or any piece of sensational news, what the public remembers is typically what it hears first. You know, and even if these things are later debunked, as they have been now by the Dutch Safety Board, the job of the misinformation has already been done.
And it's still continuing, because just before the report came out, there was another story that came from Russian authorities that found some more information about this. Could you just tell us about that?
Exactly. The Russian Defense Ministry revealed what it said were newly discovered radar images of the area at the time that MH17 was passing over it. These things had somehow been lost in the archives, and it was only now, just a few weeks before the Dutch Safety Board released its information, that they discovered these images, which proved conclusively that actually there was no other plane in the area, and it seems that it was shot down by an anti-aircraft missile, but not one that was fired from the rebel side of the conflict zone, but one that was fired from the Ukrainian side. So in essence, the Russian Defense Ministry admitted and proved that its first statements about this case were absolutely false. They admitted that they lied. There was no mention made of those earlier reports, though. So, you know, what they're doing now is trying to create another distraction or another confusion before the Dutch Safety Board investigation came out with its conclusion.
Well, talking about Russian misinformation about their involvement in Ukraine, you were there when they had the protests in Maidan about a year and a half before that. And the Russians blamed the US. And they said the US was responsible for trying to overthrow the government there. Could you just tell us about, we saw a clip of a story that you did around that time. Could you just tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, the narrative from Moscow and what we heard on the Russian news media almost from the very beginning was that the revolution in Ukraine, the sort of so-called Maidan revolution, was fomented and funded by the United States. And you know, they pointed to the fact that some American diplomats, Victoria Nuland was one, Vice President Biden appeared in Ukraine a number of times, as proof of the fact that the United States had fomented this revolution, this color revolution they call them, and they did it through, allegedly did it through NGOs, through USAID, through various pro-democracy NGOs, you know, the National Democratic Institute and so forth, that had been working for years to create the conditions for this color revolution, which was aimed really not so much as at the Ukrainian government, but at the Russian government, because its aim was to destroy Russian influence in its neighboring brotherly country and to separate Ukraine off and bring it into the Western orbit, possibly make it a member of NATO, and certainly to make it a member of the European Union. That is the story that's been circulated by Russian state media since the beginning of this. Well, I covered Maidan throughout the sort of the months that it continued throughout the winter, and saw these enormous protests in Kiev. And I can tell you that as an eyewitness, what I saw was hundreds of thousands, in some cases as many as 300,000 people in Independence Square in Kiev and in all the surrounding streets, who were basically middle-class people who were protesting corruption on the part of the Ukrainian government. In some cases, as we later found out, because the properties of President Yanukovych were subsequently investigated, examples of grotesque corruption, examples of a regime that was stealing so much money that it couldn't spend it fast enough. You know, filling houses with all sorts of gilded antiques and golden toilets and all kinds of examples of just absolutely grotesque luxury because they didn't have time to do anything else with this money, to invest it, you know. So I think that what we've seen there is another misinformation campaign that's designed to head off the kinds of investigations that take place after a new government takes over from a dictatorial government. And I think in the Russian context, it's been very successful because the Putin regime has succeeded in taking over substantially more than 90% of Russian media. There's really, in the 4 years that I was there, the last vestiges of independent media essentially been blocked or stamped out. So that what Russians consume as news now is entirely news that supports the Kremlin line and supports President Putin. And so the Maidan, the Russian view of Maidan is a really good example of that.
You know, talking about that, there's still some opposition to Putin in Russia, even though most of the media is controlled by the Kremlin. And there was an opposition figure who was killed just last year, very near to the Kremlin. And he was very well known, and it was pretty brazen the way he was killed. You covered that. Could you just tell us a little bit about that particular incident and how it illustrated how, even though there is opposition, the opposition seems to be getting beat back so much that people are pretty much seeming to resign themselves to the fact that they have this authoritarian government and there's very little they can do about it.
Yeah, the opposition figure was Boris Nemtsov. He was a longtime critic of President Putin. In fact, most recently he'd done some exposés of President Putin's own personal holdings. You know, one of the key features in President Putin's official biography is that he lives on his presidential pay and does not have any other investments, or any other outside source of income. And one of the things that Nemtsov did very effectively was publish a pamphlet showing a lot of palatial properties that, although they're shielded by layers and layers of shell companies in tax havens all over the world, you know, from Cyprus to the Bahamas to wherever, ultimately could be traced back pretty closely to President Putin. He showed that there are colossal investments parked overseas that are very closely tied to President Putin. He demonstrated from a series of photographs of President Putin in various public places that President Putin apparently has a collection of watches that's worth tens of millions of dollars. Because, in every public picture there's a watch sticking out and it's a Breguet, that's worth $60,000, or one of these watches I think was worth $500,000. All things that can't be counted on the rather modest salary of the president of Russia. So it's a tremendous embarrassment to Mr. Putin and an embarrassment to his regime. The other thing about Nemtsov that made him rather dangerous was that he had an appeal over a fairly wide swath of the Russian opposition. He was able to bring together the various factions of the Russian opposition in a way that nobody else could. Well, on this particular night, he was walking across a bridge across the Moskva River, and he was shot to death by an assailant who pulled up behind him in a car, jumped out, fired 5 bullets into his back as he was walking with his girlfriend on this bridge, and escaped.
Okay, I think we're going to get you a better microphone. I think we're having problems with your mic. So if you could, well, you're used to holding a microphone.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so I wanted to go on and say, that this was,
you actually saw an image on that little montage at the beginning of the program
I saw an image of this enormous parade. About 50,000 people turned out and marched through Moscow to mourn for Boris Nemtsov. And it was one of the most moving demonstrations that I've ever seen in that city. But the ultimate result of his assassination was that it proved that even the most visible and most popular, most widely known opposition leader in Russia can be killed with absolute impunity. The trial just started, actually, of the 5 Chechen men who are believed to have actually pulled the trigger, but there has never been an investigation, and there's never been an announcement of anyone who organized and paid for that particular crime. So the message that it gives to the opposition is that we can kill you at any time, at our leisure, and with complete impunity. And one of the things that I've seen over the past 4 years is that the opposition, which was always present and always very strong, has been gradually silenced. People no longer have the hope that, if they invest the time and take the physical risks that you have to take, that there'll be any positive result from it. And as a result, we've seen the opposition effectively silenced. That was important because we just had a parliamentary election in September that went very smoothly for the regime. And of course, we've got a presidential election coming up in 2018 in which President Putin is virtually certain to stand for election again, another 6-year term.
One of the clips we saw was about the Russian doping scandal. And a large number of Russian athletes that were supposed to take part in the Rio Olympics were banned because of this. However, it doesn't seem that anything has been done to the Russian athletics officials. What happened there in that case?
If you followed that, it seems that we're probably jumping from topic to topic here, but ultimately I think it comes down to Russian government involvement in these various stories and Russian government response to the stories when they're revealed. And if you've been following the Russian sports doping story, you know that the World Anti-Doping Agency came out with a damning report last year that said that many prominent Russian athletes, and especially some of their star track athletes, their gold medal champions in various world events, had suspicious doping profiles that were ignored for years. Since then, if you followed the New York Times story about this, there are credible allegations that the Russian sports ministry itself supervised a doping program that took place during the Winter Olympics in Sochi, and that it was systematic to the point that the urine samples of winning Russian athletes were spirited out of the laboratory where these things are tested and replaced with clean urine that these athletes had provided months before when they were not part of a doping program. So, an incredibly sophisticated and complicated and labor-intensive doping program that was designed to make sure that Russia won the majority of the medals at Sochi. And it's, the subsequent revelations have suggested that this kind of systematic doping went back as far back as 2008, at least. So that's the reason that the International Association of Athletic Federations, the IAAF, banned most Russian track athletes from competing in Rio this year. It's why the Paralympics team was absolutely banned from participating in the Paralympics. And a lot of individual Russian athletes have been sanctioned as well. The response in Russia from the Russian government has been, A, this is politicized. B, it's aimed at defaming Russian athleticism because we've been such strong competitors, throughout the world of international sports competition. And this is a way for a group of nations led by the United States to undermine our position as one of the world's great sports powers. Another frequent thing that you hear is that this is something that everybody does. You know, the Russian sports minister came out and said, well, yes, we do have a problem with doping, but you know, as a matter of fact, every country has a problem with doping, and we should fight it together. We shouldn't be singling out certain countries and punishing them for something that everybody does. Well, you may have heard it in the little montage at the beginning, but what I was saying there was that in 2013, Russian athletes had something like, they had more than 200 doping violations that were actually caught, whereas the United States, which has a team of roughly the same size, had 43. And that's a fairly fair observation of the way that Russian doping charges have followed over the last dozen years or so. So another thing that the Russians offered up was that, well, this is collective punishment, and it means that clean athletes, of whom we have many, are being punished for something that a few scoundrels tried to get away with, and that it's absolutely unfair. It's collective punishment. So all these things were floated, and the result is that I would say the Russian public, if you ask them what the doping scandal is, they would say it is a manufactured attack on Russian sports that was led by the United States, carried out by these sort of puppet-like international athletic associations that culminated in this big humiliation in Rio. It's another case of the fact that when a government, an autocratic government with no particular principles as far as how it conducts its international business, or sports or politics, is caught, it has no option but to lie and cover up as completely as it can. And in that case, you know, they did it by all the standard tactics of misinformation and propaganda.
Okay, we're going to take some questions from the audience, and we've set up a microphone in the middle of the room there, so people can line up behind the microphone if you have questions for Corey. In the meantime, I'm going to ask you about, while people are doing that, why, as an international reporter, how easy is it to report from Russia, and how does that compare with the local Russian reporters who are trying to do some independent reporting?
I would have to say that it's not very difficult to be a foreign correspondent in Russia. That is to say, I never got cooperation from the government. I never got in every story, I would always ask for comment or for an interview from a government minister who was associated with that, whatever the story happened to be. I never got one. In 4 years, I never got a positive response to my request for an interview. But I have to say, though, that I was never interfered with when I went to independent sources in Russia. I was called into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from time to time to be scolded over things that I had written if they were uncomplimentary to Russia in some way. But I was never threatened. I would say that I was never overtly hindered. I've been followed from time to time. We always assumed that we were hacked and that we were probably wiretapped. But the attitude of my Russian friends was, yeah, you're probably tapped, but the question is whether anybody's bothering to listen to you. And I think that, frankly, you know, the international media are not very important to the Russian government. They don't hear NPR in Russia, and so the Russian government really doesn't care that much about what I do. They do care some about the big international news organizations, like the New York Times. You know, they get much more upset about a New York Times report because they know that it's read in Europe, you know, and in Asia, and it has a lot of worldwide resonance. But by and large, foreign reporters are relatively safe and relatively unhindered in Russia. That's absolutely not true of independent reporters who are Russian citizens. And as we know, there have been a long and sorry list of Russian reporters and journalists who've been killed over the past dozen years. Again, like Boris Nemtsov, cases that have never been solved, cases that have never been adequately investigated, killers who've never been brought to justice, connections that have never been made to the people who ordered those killings. So once again, the situation for independent reporters or for anti-government, anti-regime reporters in Russia is very, very dangerous. And there are fewer and fewer of them than ever. Their news organizations have been shut down, or they've been bought up and co-opted by people who are associated with the Kremlin. So the situation for independent journalism in Russia right now is terrible.
Okay, we'll take a question from the audience.
Thank you, sir, for coming. I have actually two questions, if I may. The first is, to what extent do you think, if you could tell us a little about the state of the economy in Russia, considering the decline in oil prices in recent years, and the possibility that might have something to do with the possible connection between that and maybe Putin's, active foreign policy, wag the dog, wag the tail type of thing. And number two, I had another question I wanted to ask you about freedom of religion in Russia, in particular the Catholic Church, but you can make it a more general, if you may.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, I would say I had a question about the economy last night, and it's a rather difficult thing to read if you're in a big city like Moscow, which looks very prosperous right now, and very modern, rather European, with a great deal of income inequality that you don't see because very wealthy people live in the center of Moscow and people get increasingly poor as you move away. When you go to provincial cities, you see an enormous amount of unemployment. You see unpaid salaries. I mean, even people who are employed are now waiting 3 and 4 and 5 months for their salaries. Pensioners are not having their pensions raised at a time when there's terrible inflation. The Russian counter-sanctions, the sanctions that prevented European goods from being imported into Russia, have reduced the food supply quite a lot and brought in Russian substitutions that are not only not very plentiful, they're not very wholesome either. One of the things that was banned from import into Russia was most European cheeses. And Russia, by the way, imports, although it used to be an incredible agricultural power, now imports an enormous amount of its food. So these...
Why is that so?
That's because there are a lot of reasons, but one is that the Russian government has not supported agriculture in the way that the Soviet government used to. So a lot of these agricultural businesses have been forced on their own and with very little support.
They've been reliant more on the petroleum exports.
Yeah, so petroleum exports were paying for imported food, and that's not happening anymore. So the thing about the cheese is that Russian-made cheeses have appeared on the shelves at a time when dairy production has gone down slightly. So we get more cheese, but less dairy production. And what we find is that there's an enormous import of palm oil, industrial-grade palm oil from other countries that are not under the sanctions. And that's what this cheese is being made from these days. So believe me, you don't want to eat cheese from a Russian supermarket if you can avoid it. But anyway, so that's the state of the economy. I think the thing that Western commentators sometimes miss, though, is that Russia is still a very wealthy country in resource terms. And even when oil prices are as low as they are today, Russia is still making money. And one of the reasons that the Russian government is making money is because they sell their oil for dollars and they pay their employees in rubles. Dollars are worth a lot. Rubles are worth half what they were just a few years ago. So that means a pretty large profit for the government. That means that economy is going to stagnate and drag along and not do well, and particularly that ordinary people will suffer for the next few years, but it's not going to collapse.
Okay, thank you very much. Could we have the next?
Yeah,
person?
we didn't get to the freedom of religion.
Oh yes,
thing.
yeah.
And I do want to say that my latest stories on freedom of religion had to do with the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons, who are seen as absolute enemies of the Russian state. And there's as you probably know, there are a series of rather draconian laws that were passed just this summer that prevented people from doing door-to-door missionary work. So all evangelical religions are hurt by that, and also prevents people from having religious meetings in their homes.
But I thought that there was a resurgence of the Russian Orthodox Church, and so it's at the expense of other religions?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. The Orthodox Church has state support. The Orthodox Church is strongly supportive of the Kremlin position. You know, the Patriarch Kirill said that President Putin is a gift from God, or a miracle from God, I believe. So, yeah, the Russian Orthodox Church is very strong and well-funded, but all other churches, and the Catholic Church as well, are really struggling under very difficult political conditions.
Thank you.
Welcome to Sacred Heart. It's an honor to have you here, Mr. Flintoff. You've done really important journalism over the years, and we're happy to have you here today. You mentioned Russia's seeming preference for Donald Trump in the upcoming U.S. election, and you talked a little bit about why that might be. If we could ask you to speculate for just a minute, and I know that this would be speculation, what do you think the attraction for him, Trump, to Putin is? What is that flirtation really all about? Knowing that this is speculation.
All right. I retired from NPR as of the end of September, so I can actually do things like speculate. I was never able to do before. I think that, you know, that what Donald Trump has told us about himself is that he really favors a strongman type of government. He really believes that an individual leader, you know, with very strong control, a very strong centralized control, can, you know, make what he would call a better deal for the country. And I think that what he admires in President Putin is that President Putin is the ultimate strongman leader. You know, he does have an incredible degree of control over his government and his regime. And the other thing we know about Donald Trump is that he really believes in personal popularity. And President Putin has something like 83% right now. We know that that's because he also has 99% control over the news media, and thus can control what his image looks like to the Russian people. But I think those are the kinds of things that are attractive based on what Mr. Trump has said about himself.
Well, thank you so much, Corey Flintoff. Thank you for spending some time with us. We have one more question? Two more?
Yeah, two more.
Okay, well, we'll do the two questions, and then those will be the two last questions. I didn't see you. I'm sorry about that.
No, that's all right. First off, I'd like to say welcome. You've covered a lot of stories throughout your career. What influences you to go after a specific story?
That's a good question. You know, I would say that one thing I've learned by being in the company of foreign correspondents is that they are invariably traveling people. That is to say that they are people who come from traveling families. They tend to be the children of diplomats, or the children of missionaries, or the children of overseas business people. By and large, they're people that had some kind of youthful experience with traveling in foreign cultures. And I'm no different. My mother worked for Pan American Airways, the biggest international American airline in its day. And so we got to travel around really cheaply. And it gave us an opportunity to see lots of parts of the world that we wouldn't ordinarily have been able to see. And that gave me a taste for wanting to see foreign countries and foreign cultures. And since I was already a reporter, it was something, a kind of a natural thing to want to report on those places. So that's part of it. The other thing is that, the more foreign reporting you do, you realize how closely intertwined these things are with our own country. We can see it during our election cycle right now, that there seems to be a kind of a zeitgeist that is leading to more nationalism, more separatism, more autocratic style leaders in various parts of the world where we never thought that this was going to happen again. And we're part of that. Brexit was another example for us, of what nationalism and what economic isolationism can do. And the fact that when people are allowed to vote in referenda on these things, they will often surprise the sort of pundits and the establishment, and there seems to be a lot of anger against the establishment right now. So those things are so closely intertwined that I think for me, covering foreign news was a way of trying to understand the United States.
Okay. Do we have the last question?
Yeah, thank you very much, Corey. Your voice resonates in my car often in the years gone by. So good journalism is very hard to get today, especially here. So a credit to you and your organization for what you've produced in years gone by, because it's heartwarming to listen to journalism that is so profoundly quality in its enterprise. So we miss more of it. Just rounding back, if I can, to President Putin, it was slightly mentioned in the Vice President's debate. I think it's a misnomer to call him President Putin, because he is a dictator. In any other frame of reference, he's a dictator. If you're a journalist, you're assassinated. If you're a politician, the chances are you're assassinated. So most people in Russia today don't speak out because they're scared of the system. And as we see your last comment going towards a political movement to the right, we see it in the United Kingdom, which is with Brexit was a shock to the European Union. We see it in the Philippines with regard to the latest comments about drug users and how they should be effectively killed. And we see a political dynamic within the United States that is worrying, depending on which side you wish to come from, about where we're moving towards maintaining globalization as an outreach, as against moving back within our borders and shutting down that outreach. I'm just curious in terms of your concern about that global outlook and the possibility for a conflict as a result. Because even yesterday there was 2 Russian jets that were shadowed by the Spanish, the British and the German, I think, NATO allies, flying down to the coast of Spain from Russia on the way back. It's been reported in the last 3 days that the American embassy staff have been harassed for the last 3 years in Moscow and other parts of Russia. So there's a very aggressive tact being taken by Putin to sort of want a conflict. I'm just curious to your perspective as a journalist, what that means for all of us as to where we're going.
I have to say, unfortunately, that I came away from my time in Russia feeling that the danger of sparking a conflict, especially one that could be sparked by accident, is a lot greater than it used to be. And the examples you cited, these encounters between NATO and Russian military aircraft are an opportunity for really serious things to happen. I think that the Russian defense establishment, and I think that Mr. Putin understand that even though they have rebuilt their military substantially, they're no match for the United States and for NATO. So I think that, say that the United States shot down a Russian jet, as the Turks did, on the Syrian border, I think that the repercussions would not be a direct conflict between the United States and Russia. But I think that the result could be another one of these proxy wars, like what we see going on now in Syria. And, that we've seen how those proxy wars can metastasize and give birth to movements like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and, generally increase the danger in those areas, enormously. So I think that kind of danger, the danger that we could see continued widespread conflict around the world, triggered by the sort of existential conflict between Russia and the West, is really multiplied, and we're really in a sort of a dangerous area right now.
No way that could be diffused in any way.
Conceivably it could. I know people in the nuclear, the non-proliferation community, who believe passionately that they can still negotiate with their Russian counterparts because they believe that the Russians understand, at least people in the Russian nuclear establishment understand that this is an unwinnable situation for either side. And that no matter how much saber rattling they may do, it's going to take patient diplomacy for them to hang on to the shreds of our nuclear treaties that remain and to prevent things from going any further south. So I think that kind of cooperation can go on, but I think we're in for a really long, prolonged period of continued conflict.
Well, Corey, thank you so much. Really appreciate your spending your time here with us.
Thank you. It's a great opportunity for me.